Talking to Kelly Link. Kelly, you're someone who writes SF and fantasy in ordinary milieus like suburban homes and convenience stores. Can you talk about what makes that interesting to you as opposed to more traditional SFF settings like alternate worlds and spaceships and so forth?
Well, when I read, I like fantasy and science fiction. I like epic fantasy. I'm reading the George Martin new book right now. I like traditional science fiction as well, but when I write, it doesn't seem to be the kind of setting that comes naturally to me. And maybe it's because it's slightly less explored, kind of. There's less fantasy that takes place in convenience stores, so there's more territory for me.
Yeah, it's funny. These environments that we're in most often are the ones that aren't explored in this particular field of literature as much. And you're somebody who's had a lot of crossover success between mainstream writing and genre writing. Do you think that's because the borders are breaking down? And do you think that's important at all if the borders are breaking down and that things are crossing over?
I think there's less anxiety about there's less anxiety about what you're supposed to read. So I think we seem to be at the point now where everybody agrees that if you read, it's a pretty good thing, and so therefore books that people like to read, whether it's J.K. Rowling, George R.R. Martin, Ian Banks, if you like to read it, that's probably okay. The other part of that being that there's it's easier for people to find the kind of books they like, or a community of people who will direct them at the kind of books that they like. So I now see a lot more people at conventions like this who a couple of years ago wouldn't have found ReaderCon, but because they're friends with somebody on Facebook or they're online and they found out about it, they show up.
Did you find there was any resistance to you to the fact that you self-identify as a science fiction writer when you were doing, I don't know, interviews with more mainstream presses or dealing with people who are more mainstream book people?
If there is, maybe people are too polite to sort of put it to your face. But no, when I started writing, I figured that I would be writing for, if I was lucky, magazines like Asimov's and Fantasy and Science Fiction. And those are still magazines that I like to publish in. It's just that there are other places that are more open to weird stuff like Conjunctions and Tin House and other places.
And what do you think the future holds for genre and genre fiction?
I don't know. I think the future of publishing we're kind of at a weird point as far as publishing goes, period. I think that fantasy will continue to sell. I am seeing a lot more books right now that I would have thought of as horror. If they were being published in the 80s, they would have had a particular look to them. They would have been identified as horror, and now they're sort of just being published as fiction. But that's terrific, because I think for a while it felt as if a lot of the horror novelists, there's Stephen King, who's terrific, and there's Peter Straub, and then there were not a lot of other people writing traditional horror novels, which I love. So there's a couple things going on. One is that there are sort of fads or cycles in publishing, and the other is just that there maybe it's also just that there are the magazines are more open to weird stuff or to weird genres, and therefore sort of the publishing houses, and so everything is sort of coming back all at once.
And do you think that short fiction is becoming, because you're somebody who writes short fiction almost exclusively at this point, and who's very invested in short fiction, who publishes short fiction, do you think short fiction is with electronic media that it's sort of coming back as a valid thing that people will read in a way that they haven't been for the past 50 years or so?
I hope so. I mean, there are a number of writers who have had for the last 20, 30 years pretty successful careers as short story writers, both in genre and also outside. I think it was a while ago it was more possible to make a living as a writer of short fiction. Now it's a little bit harder, but I think every year there are over a dozen terrific collections that come out that seem to get picked up by readers. And I don't know if that's changed. I think maybe I'm just more attuned to the short. I've always been more interested in the short fiction anyway, so I've just always been more aware of it. And I don't know if for the average reader if it's more on the radar or not.
Fair enough.